Okay, so these next couple of videos are going to go over how to algebraically solve quadratic functions. You don't have to write this slide in your notes, but you can if you want to. There's 4 different methods to solving quadratic functions. The first one we're going to do today is the zero product property. The second method is factoring, and I'm going to show you how to factor using the tic-tac-toe method. Then there's taking the square root of the function and completing the square. And finally, there's the quadratic formula. Not every method works for every function. Okay, you're going to have to decide which method to use depending on how the function works. The one method that does always work is the quadratic formula. So the zero product property, this is where you are going to start taking your notes. So our first step, okay, you are going to make sure that the function is set up as 2 binomials and then make them equal to 0. So when I say 2 binomials, I mean something times something else. So you should have one set of parentheses times another set of parentheses. Just like I have in my example where I have x minus 7 times x plus 2. And then all I did was add equals 0. Next thing you're going to do is separate them into 2 separate equations. So I'm just going to rewrite it as x minus 7 equals 0 and x plus 2 equals 0. Your third and final step is just to solve. So for my first equation, x minus 7, I'm going to add 7 to both sides. So x equals 7. In my second equation, x plus 2 equals 0. So I'm going to subtract 2 from both sides. So x equals negative 2. So for this particular function, that means my x-intercepts are at 7 and negative 2. So if you're still writing, just pause, and then we'll go on to our next example. So our next example, this is the hardest example I could find. I wanted to do this to show you guys how easy it actually is. So I have 7x times x minus 11 minus 2 times x minus 11 equals 0. If you look, these are not 2 binomials. The subtraction sign in the middle makes it so that it's not 2 binomials because we're not multiplying them by each other. So we're going to have to use the distributive property in reverse to rewrite them before we can do anything else. So if we break this down, okay, 7x is multiplying x minus 11. Negative 2 is also multiplying x minus 11. So we can take those and put them together since they're both multiplying x minus 11. So when I rewrite them, I have 7x minus 2 times x minus 11. And I'm going to set that equal to 0 just like I did last time. So now my new equation is 7x minus 2 times x minus 11, and that's all going to equal 0. So basically when you see a subtraction or an addition sign separating them, all you're going to do is take the 2 things that we're multiplying it by and put them together. So since we were multiplying by 7x and we're multiplying by minus 2, I put them together to get 7x minus 2. Okay, now we're going to do the same thing we did before. We're going to separate them into 2 equations and solve. So my first equation is 7x minus 2 equals 0. And my second equation is x minus 11 equals 0. So for my first equation, I'm going to add 2 to both sides and get 7x equals 2. And for my second equation, I'm going to add 11 to both sides and get x equals 11. Last step, I'm going to get x alone by dividing both sides by 7. So I get x equals 2 over 7. And then my last equation was already solved, so that's x equals 11. So the x-intercepts for this problem are 2 over 7 and 11. And I'm just going to let you guys keep writing. If you need to, pause the video, and then we'll do one more example before you can go on and do your classwork. Okay, second example. So now we have f of x equals negative 0.2 times x minus 1.9 times x minus 3.5. So even though this looks different, it's still already written as two binomials because we're multiplying. There's no addition or subtraction sign in between our two sets of parentheses. So we can actually just ignore that negative 0.2 because as long as our two sets of parentheses equal 0, when we multiply them by negative 0.2, our final answer is still going to be 0. So we're just going to pretend the negative 0.2 isn't there, and we're going to separate these into two equations. So I have x minus 1.9 equals 0, and x minus 3.5 equals 0. I'm going to add 1.9 to both sides for my first equation, so x equals 1.9, and I'm going to add 3.5 to both sides and get x equals 3.5. Okay, so that's the end of the notes. The best way to deal with solving algebraically using the zero product property is to practice. That's why I assigned some practice problems from the book for you guys. Be sure to check your answers using the teacher's edition. That way you're not doing all the practice problems and thinking you're doing it correctly and you're actually not doing it correctly. So while you're doing the practice problems or as you're doing them, make sure you're also checking your answers in the teacher's edition. You can also get some extra practice from IXL if you do skill BB.6, and I listed that on your matrix. If you have any questions, you can message me on Remind or send me a message on Schoology.